Forget everything you knew about the Silk Road. Before the deserts were conquered, a much deadlier empire was being built across the crashing waves of the Indian Ocean. Imagine standing on a salt-stained deck, navigating lethal monsoon winds with nothing but a wooden rudder and a prayer. For medieval sailors, a single bag of cloves would feel the sting of the spray and the agony of scurvy as we trace the world's most dangerous trade routes. Discover how these forgotten sailors connected the world.
The world before the medieval spice trade was not a collection of isolated civilizations, but rather a vast, interconnected web of commerce that stretched from the Atlantic shores of West Africa to the Pacific coasts of China. This intricate network, which had been developing for millennia, provided the foundation upon which the maritime spice trade would build its most spectacular achievements. Understanding this pre-existing world is essential to grasping the full significance of the maritime routes that would later be celebrated as the forgotten Silk Road of the sea, long before European explorers rounded the Cape of Good Hope. The Indian Ocean functioned as a superhighway of commerce, culture, and ideas. The monsoon winds, which blow consistently from the southwest between April and October, and then reverse direction from the northeast between October and April, had been understood and exploited by sailors since at least the 1st century CE. These predictable wind patterns allowed merchants to plan voyages with remarkable precision, sailing from the coast of East Africa to India with the summer monsoon and returning with the winter winds. This natural rhythm of the ocean created a calendar of commerce that structured the lives of port cities, merchants, and sailors across the entire Indian Ocean basin. The Roman Empire had established direct maritime trade with India as early as the 1st century CE, with ships departing from Egyptian ports on the Red Sea to reach the Malabar coast. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a 1st century Greek text written by an anonymous Egyptian merchant, describes in meticulous detail the ports, goods, and sailing conditions of this maritime network. According to this document, pepper from the Malabar coast was already being shipped in enormous quantities to the Roman world, where it was prized for both culinary and medicinal purposes. The trade was so significant that the Romans established permanent trading posts in southern India, and Indian embassies are recorded as having visited the Emperor Augustus. The rise of Islam in the 7th century did not disrupt this maritime network, but rather expanded and unified it. The new religion spread rapidly along existing trade routes, carried by merchants who found that their commercial networks provided perfect pathways for the dissemination of faith. By the 8th century, Muslim merchants from Arabia, Persia, and Gujarat dominated the Indian Ocean trade, establishing communities in port cities from Zanzibar to Canton. These merchants did not simply trade goods. They created institutions that facilitated long-distance commerce. The Islamic legal tradition provided standardized contracts, partnerships, and inheritance rules that reduced the risks of trade. The concept of the commenda, a form of partnership in which one party provided capital, while the other undertook the voyage, became widespread across the Indian Ocean world and would later be adopted by European merchants as the basis for their own commercial expansion. The Tang dynasty in China, 618-907 CE, represented the eastern terminus of this maritime network. Chinese records from this period describe thriving communities of Persian and Arab merchants in the southern ports of Guangzhou and Quanzhou, where they were granted their own quarters, mosques, and legal autonomy. The famous Belitung shipwreck, discovered in 1998 off the coast of Indonesia, provides dramatic archaeological confirmation of this trade. The wreck, an Arab dhow dating to approximately 830 CE, contained more than 60,000 ceramic bowls, along with gold and silver vessels, bronze mirrors, and spices. The cargo was so well preserved that some of the ceramics still bore the date of their firing, and organic materials, including star anise and frankincense, were recovered intact. This single shipwreck testifies to the scale and sophistication of maritime commerce that linked Tang China with the Abbasid Caliphate centered in Baghdad. The role of Southeast Asia in this pre-existing network cannot be overstated. The kingdom of Srivijaya, centered on the island of Sumatra, controlled the Straits of Malacca from approximately the 7th to the 13th centuries. This narrow waterway, through which all maritime traffic between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea had to pass, became a source of immense wealth for Srivijaya, which taxed passing ships and provided services to merchants waiting for the monsoon winds to shift. The Srivijayan capital at Palembang became a cosmopolitan center where merchants from India, Arabia, Persia, China, and the Indonesian archipelago gathered to exchange goods, ideas, and cultures. The kingdom's control of the spice-producing regions of the Moluccas gave it additional leverage over the trade in cloves, nutmeg, and mace, which were worth more than their weight in gold in distant markets. India, and particularly the Malabar coast on the southwestern shore of the subcontinent, occupied the central position in this maritime network. The port of Calicut, which would later become famous as the destination of Vasco da Gama's voyage, had already emerged as a major entrepot by the 12th century. Ruled by a Hindu dynasty known as the Zamorins, Calicut cultivated a policy of religious tolerance and commercial openness that attracted merchants from across the Indian Ocean. The city was renowned for its policy of ensuring safe conduct to all merchants, a practice that gave it a competitive advantage over other ports where political instability or religious conflict might threaten foreign traders. The Jewish merchants whose records were preserved in the Cairo Geniza provide an extraordinary window into the workings of this maritime world. From approximately 950 to 1250 CE, these merchants, based primarily in Cairo, but with agents and partners from Spain to India, left behind a collection of some 15,000 documents that detail the routine operations of long-distance trade. These documents reveal a sophisticated world of commercial correspondence legal contracts, partnership agreements, and family letters. They show that merchants routinely entrusted enormous sums to ship captains and agents, relying on networks of trust and reputation that spanned thousands of miles. The Geniza documents also reveal the dangers of this trade. Shipwrecks, pirates, political instability, and the death of partners are recurring themes, often mentioned with a matter-of-fact tone that suggests such misfortunes were expected risks of the trade. The goods that moved through this network were remarkably diverse. From the Moluccas came cloves, nutmeg, and mace, spices that grew nowhere else on earth and were therefore extraordinarily valuable. From India came pepper, cardamom, ginger, and cinnamon, along with cotton textiles, precious gems, and steel. From China came silk, porcelain, tea, and lacquerware. From East Africa came gold, ivory, and mangrove poles used in construction. From Arabia came frankincense, myrrh, and Arabian horses, which were highly prized by Indian rulers. From the Persian Gulf came pearls and dates. This was not simply a luxury trade in high-value, low-bulk goods. It also included bulk commodities like rice, timber, and textiles that were essential to daily life in many regions. The Silk Road, the overland network of trade routes that connected China to the Mediterranean, operated in parallel with these maritime routes. While the maritime routes carried bulk goods like ceramics and spices, the overland routes were essential for goods that were too fragile or too valuable to risk on the open sea. Silk, the commodity that gave the overland routes their name, was actually transported by both sea and land. But the overland routes through Central Asia were particularly important for goods that required careful handling. The two networks were not competitors, but complements, serving different markets and different commodities, while overlapping in the great commercial centers of the Middle East and Central Asia. The Byzantine Empire controlled the western terminus of the overland Silk Road through its capital, Constantinople. For centuries, this city served as the great clearinghouse, where Asian goods were transferred from the caravans that had carried them across the steppes and mountains of Central Asia to the ships and pack animals that would distribute them throughout Europe. The Byzantine control of this choke point gave the empire immense economic and political power, allowing it to tax the flow of luxury goods from the East and to control the access of European kingdoms to Asian spices and silks. The Crusades, which began in 1096 and continued for nearly 2 centuries, had a profound impact on this pre-existing network. While the Crusades were ostensibly religious wars aimed at recovering the Holy Land from Muslim control, they also had significant economic dimensions. The establishment of Crusader states in the Levant opened new opportunities for European merchants, particularly from the Italian city-states of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, to establish direct trading relationships with the producers of Asian goods. The port of Acre, in particular, became a major center of east-west trade during the Crusader period, attracting merchants from across the Mediterranean and beyond. The Mongol Empire, which rose to power in the 13th century under Genghis Khan and his successors, transformed the Eurasian trading network. The Mongols unified, for the first time in history, the entire land mass from China to Eastern Europe under a single political authority. The Pax Mongolica, or Mongol peace, that resulted from this unification dramatically reduced the risks of overland travel. Merchants could now travel from Beijing to Baghdad with relative safety, protected by a system of way stations and a legal framework that encouraged commerce. The Mongol rulers actively promoted trade, providing loans to merchants, maintaining roads and bridges, and establishing a unified system of weights and measures. The Mongol Empire also brought China into direct contact with the Islamic world and Europe, facilitating an unprecedented exchange of goods, technologies, and ideas. The accounts of travelers like Marco Polo, who journeyed from Venice to China via the overland Silk Road between 1271 and 1295, reflect the opportunities created by Mongol rule. Polo's descriptions of the wealth and sophistication of Chinese civilization, particularly the splendors of Hangzhou, which he called Quinsai, captured the European imagination and stimulated interest in direct access to Asian markets. Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan scholar who traveled throughout the Islamic world and beyond between 1325 and 1354, provides an even more comprehensive picture of the interconnected world of the 14th century. His travels took him from his native Tangier to Mecca, Persia, East Africa, India, the Maldives, China, and back across the Sahara to West Africa. His account describes a world in which Muslim merchants and scholars moved with relative ease across vast distances, finding welcome in communities of coreligionists in port cities from Zanzibar to Canton. The existence of this pre-existing network of maritime and overland trade has important implications for understanding the later European voyages of discovery. When Vasco da Gama reached Calicut in 1498, he did not discover a new world, but rather inserted himself into an ancient and sophisticated trading network. The merchants he encountered in Calicut were not surprised to see Europeans. They had been trading with Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Persians, and Chinese for centuries. What was new was not the sea route, but the European determination to control it, to exclude Muslim merchants, and to establish direct trade with the sources of spices. This determination would eventually transform the Indian Ocean world, but it built upon foundations that had been laid over more than a millennium of maritime commerce. The maritime network of the Indian Ocean was not simply an economic phenomenon. It was also a conduit for the exchange of cultures, religions, and ideas. Buddhism spread from India to Southeast Asia and China along these maritime routes. Islam spread from Arabia to India, Southeast Asia, and East Africa through the same channels. the Hindu and Buddhist kingdoms of Southeast Asia, including Srivijaya and the Majapahit Empire, drew their cultural inspiration from India, adapting Sanskrit literature, Indian architectural styles, and Hindu and Buddhist religious practices to their own contexts. The maritime routes also facilitated the movement of peoples, from the Austronesian migrations that populated the islands of the Pacific and Indian Oceans, to the settlement of Arab and Persian merchants in India, Southeast Asia, and China. The shipbuilding traditions that developed along these maritime routes were sophisticated and diverse. The Arab dhow, with its characteristic lateen sail and hull planks sewn together with coconut fiber, was perfectly adapted to the conditions of the Indian Ocean. These vessels, which could range in size from small coastal craft to ocean-going ships capable of carrying hundreds of tons of cargo, were built using techniques that had been developed over centuries of experience. The Chinese junk, with its multiple masts, watertight compartments, and sophisticated rudder, represented another highly advanced shipbuilding tradition. The two traditions met and influenced each other in the ports of Southeast Asia, where ships from both traditions would have been seen side by side. Navigation in this maritime world relied on a combination of celestial observation, knowledge of the monsoon winds, and practical experience. Arab and Persian navigators had developed sophisticated techniques for determining latitude using the stars, and they kept detailed records of the routes and sailing conditions between ports. The routes themselves were defined by the monsoon winds, which created a rhythm of commerce that structured the lives of port cities. Ships would depart from one region with the monsoon, spend several months at their destination, trading and waiting for the winds to shift, and then return with the opposite monsoon. This pattern meant that merchants and sailors often spent extended periods in foreign ports, creating permanent communities of expatriate merchants who facilitated ongoing trade. The decline of the overland Silk Road was not caused by European maritime exploration, as is sometimes suggested, but rather by the collapse of the Mongol Empire and the rise of new powers that disrupted overland trade. The breakup of the Mongol Empire in the 14th century led to the emergence of successor states that were often hostile to each other, making overland travel more dangerous. The rise of the Ottoman Empire, which captured Constantinople in 1453, consolidated control over the land routes from Asia to Europe. While the Ottoman conquest is often cited as a cause of European maritime exploration, the reality is more complex. The Ottomans did not close the overland routes, but rather imposed taxes and regulations that made maritime alternatives more attractive to European merchants. The legacy of this pre-existing maritime world is still visible today. The distribution of Muslim populations across the Indian Ocean, from East Africa to Indonesia, reflects the spread of Islam along trade routes that had been established centuries before European arrival. The cuisines of these regions show the influence of Indian spices, Chinese techniques, and Middle Eastern ingredients that were exchanged through maritime commerce. The languages of the region, from Swahili in East Africa to Malay in Southeast Asia, bear the marks of centuries of maritime contact, incorporating loanwords from Arabic, Persian, Sanskrit, and Chinese. Understanding this pre-existing world is essential for appreciating the achievements and the limitations of the maritime spice trade that would develop in the medieval period. The forgotten Silk Road of the sea did not emerge from nothing. It was built upon foundations that had been laid over more than 1,000 years of maritime commerce. The medieval period would see this network expand, intensify, and become more integrated. But it would always remain part of a larger story of human connection across the waters that separate the continents of Asia, Africa, and Europe. The spice trade of the medieval period was not merely a commercial enterprise, but rather a complex economic system that involved the production, processing, transportation, and marketing of some of the most valuable commodities in human history. The spices that traveled from the remote islands of Southeast Asia to the tables of European nobles represented a convergence of geography, botany, economics, and human desire that shaped the course of global history. Understanding the spice economy requires examining not only the spices themselves, but also the systems of production, the networks of distribution, the mechanisms of pricing and valuation, and the markets that consumed these extraordinary products. The spices that dominated medieval trade came from a relatively small number of locations, each with its own unique ecological requirements and production methods. Pepper, the most widely traded spice in terms of volume, grew on the Malabar coast of southwestern India, where the tropical climate and abundant rainfall provided ideal conditions for the pepper vine. Black pepper was produced by picking the peppercorns while still green and allowing them to ferment and dry, while white pepper came from fully ripe berries from which the outer skin had been removed. The pepper vines were cultivated on supports, often using living trees or bamboo poles, and required constant attention to produce the best quality berries. The harvest was labor-intensive, with each peppercorn picked by hand, and the processing required careful attention to ensure proper fermentation and drying. Cinnamon and cassia, often confused in European sources, came from different sources. True cinnamon, Cinnamomum verum, was native to Sri Lanka, where it was produced from the inner bark of the cinnamon tree. The production process involved cutting the branches, scraping off the outer bark, and then carefully peeling the inner bark, which would curl into quills as it dried. Cassia, a related but inferior product, came from southern China and Southeast Asia, and was produced using a similar process, but with a thicker bark and a stronger, more pungent flavor. The distinction between the two was important in medieval markets, with with true cinnamon commanding significantly higher prices. Cloves, nutmeg, and mace came from the Moluccas, the spice islands of eastern Indonesia, and were found nowhere else on Earth before the 18th century. Clove trees were native to 5 small islands: Ternate, Tidor, Modi, Makian, and Bacan. The clove tree produced flower buds that were picked just before opening and then dried, producing the familiar spice. The clove tree was demanding, requiring specific soil conditions and altitudes, and the harvest was carefully controlled by the local rulers, who recognized the value of their monopoly. Nutmeg and mace came from the Banda Islands, a small archipelago south of the Moluccas. The nutmeg tree produced a fruit that, when split open, revealed a seed surrounded by a bright red aril. The aril, when dried, became mace, while the seed itself was the nutmeg. Like the clove trees, nutmeg trees were limited to a specific microclimate and could not easily be cultivated elsewhere. Ginger, cardamom, and turmeric were more widely distributed across South and Southeast Asia. Ginger was cultivated throughout India and Southeast Asia, with the best quality coming from the Malabar coast and the islands of the Indonesian archipelago. The ginger plant was a rhizome that required rich, well-drained soil and abundant rainfall. The rhizomes were harvested after the leaves had died back, then cleaned, dried, and sometimes bleached to improve their appearance. Cardamom grew in the forests of the Malabar coast and Sri Lanka, where the cardamom plants flourished in the shade of the forest canopy. The small green pods were harvested by hand and then dried, a process that required careful attention to preserve the delicate flavor. Turmeric, a relative of ginger, was cultivated throughout South and Southeast Asia for both culinary and medicinal uses, with its bright yellow color making it valuable for dyeing textiles as well as for cooking. The production of spices was embedded in complex social and economic systems. In the Malabar coast, pepper production was organized through a system of small-scale cultivators who sold their harvest to local merchants, who then aggregated the pepper for sale to larger traders. The pepper vines were often grown as a secondary crop, interplanted with coconut palms or other trees, and provided an important source of cash income for rural households. In Sri Lanka, cinnamon production was controlled by the royal government, which maintained the cinnamon forests as a state monopoly and organized the harvesting and processing of the bark. In the Moluccas, the production of cloves, nutmeg, and mace was controlled by local sultanates that carefully regulated the harvest to maintain high prices and prevent the spread of the trees to other regions. The spices moved from their points of production to the great entrepôts, where they would be aggregated, sorted, and redistributed. The primary entrepôt for pepper was Calicut on the Malabar coast, where merchants from across the Indian Ocean gathered to purchase pepper from the local producers. Calicut's rulers, the Zamorans, maintained a policy of open trade, welcoming merchants from all nations and religions, and providing secure warehouses and fair weighing facilities. The pepper trade was so important to Calicut that the city was was sometimes called the City of Spice, and its prosperity depended on maintaining the flow of pepper from the interior to the port. Other Malabar ports, including Cochin, Cannanore, and Quilon, also handled significant volumes of pepper, but never rivaled Calicut's dominance. For the spices of Southeast Asia, the great entrepot was Malacca, located on the Malay Peninsula at the narrowest point of the Straits of Malacca. Malacca's strategic location, commanding the straits through which all maritime traffic between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea had to pass, made it the natural gathering point for spices from the Moluccas, Java, Sumatra, and the other islands of the Indonesian archipelago. The city's rulers, who converted to Islam in the 15th century, created a sophisticated commercial infrastructure that included warehouses, weighing houses, and a legal system that enforced contracts and protected merchants. Malacca's port was visited by ships from China, India, Arabia, Persia, and the islands of Southeast Asia, making it one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the world. The journey of spices from the Spice Islands to Malacca was itself a complex commercial operation. Javanese and Malay merchants, who had intimate knowledge of the Indonesian archipelago, sailed eastward to the Moluccas and the Bandas to purchase cloves, nutmeg, and mace from the local rulers. These voyages were dangerous, requiring navigation through treacherous waters and negotiating with local potentates who might demand high prices or engage in sharp practices. The merchants would exchange Indian textiles, Chinese ceramics, and other goods for the spices, which they would then transport back to Malacca for sale to the larger traders. This system of multiple intermediaries, with each layer adding to the cost, resulted in spices that had increased dramatically in price by the time they reached the Mediterranean. The next stage in the spice journey involved transportation across the Indian Ocean. Ships from Malacca, carrying the spices of the Moluccas, along with pepper from Sumatra and Java, would sail west with the monsoon winds, making the crossing to Ceylon or the Malabar coast. From there, the spices would be transferred to ships bound for the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf. The route through the Red Sea involved sailing to the Yemeni port of Aden, which served as the gateway to the Red Sea, and through it to Egypt and the Mediterranean. The route through the Persian Gulf involved sailing to Hormuz, the great emporium at the entrance to the Gulf, from which goods were transported overland to Baghdad and the Mediterranean ports of the Levant. Aden, located on the southwestern corner of the Arabian Peninsula, played a crucial role in the spice trade as the entrepot that connected the Indian Ocean to the Red Sea. The city's natural harbor, protected by the volcanic mountains that surrounded it, provided safe anchorage for ships waiting for the monsoon winds to shift. The merchants of Aden, many of whom were descended from families that had been involved in the Indian Ocean trade for centuries, provided services to the spice traders, including warehousing, financing, and arranging for the onward shipment of goods through the Red Sea. The Rasulid sultans, who ruled Yemen from the 13th to the 15th centuries, actively promoted Aden's trade by maintaining the port facilities, providing security, and even establishing stipends to support the mosques of Malabar. A remarkable example of the religious networks that accompanied the spice trade. The transportation of spices through the Red Sea involved a second set of maritime challenges. The Red Sea was difficult to navigate, with its narrow passages, coral reefs, and contrary winds. Ships from Aden would sail northward, often making slow progress against the prevailing winds, to the Egyptian ports of Qusair and Idhab, from which spices were transported overland to the Nile, and then to Cairo. Alternatively, ships would proceed to Suez at the northern end of the Red Sea, where the spices would be unloaded for the short overland journey to Cairo. The Fatimid and later Mamluk rulers of Egypt recognized the importance of the spice trade and organized the transportation and taxation of spices through their territories, extracting revenues that supported their military and administrative systems. Once spices reached Cairo, they entered the final stage of their journey to European markets. Cairo was the greatest commercial city of the Islamic world, with a population that may have reached 500,000 in the medieval period. The spice market in Cairo was a spectacle of color and fragrance, with merchants from across the Mediterranean and the Islamic world gathering to purchase the precious commodities that had traveled so far. The spices were sold in bulk to European merchants, primarily from Venice and Genoa, who maintained permanent establishments in Cairo and other Egyptian cities. These merchants had obtained trading privileges from the Mamluk sultans, paying customs duties and other fees in exchange for the right to purchase spices and other goods for export to Europe. The final leg of the spice journey involved transportation across the Mediterranean. Venetian and Genoese ships would carry the spices from Egyptian ports to Venice, Genoa, and other Italian cities, from which they would be distributed throughout Europe. The Italian city-states had developed sophisticated commercial systems for financing these voyages, with partnerships, insurance, and credit that spread the risks and rewards of the trade. The spices would be sold at the great trade fairs of Europe, including those of Champagne in France, which served as meeting places for merchants from across the continent. The prices at these fairs reflected not only the costs of production and transportation, but also the risks, the duties, and the profits of the many intermediaries involved in the spice trade. The pricing of spices in medieval Europe was determined by a complex interplay of supply and demand, with supplies often fluctuating due to wars, piracy, weather, and political disruptions. Pepper, which was the most abundant spice in terms of volume, was often used as a standard of value, with prices quoted in relation to pepper. In England, for example, pepper prices varied significantly over the medieval period, from a low of about 6 pence per pound in the 13th century to a high of 30 pence or more in the 14th century when disruptions to trade caused shortages. These variations had significant economic impacts, with high prices benefiting the merchants who controlled the supply, and high prices harming the consumers who depended on spices for cooking and medicine. The demand for spices in medieval Europe was driven by multiple factors that went far beyond simple taste preferences. Spices were used extensively in cooking, particularly by the wealthy, who could afford to incorporate them into elaborate dishes that demonstrated their status and sophistication. The idea that spices were used primarily to mask the taste of spoiled meat is a myth. The wealthy had access to fresh meat, and spices were used to create complex flavor profiles that reflected the international origins of the ingredients. Spices also had important medicinal uses, with pepper, ginger, and cinnamon prescribed for a range of ailments from digestive disorders to respiratory infections. The medical texts of the medieval period, which drew on ancient Greek and Islamic sources, recommended spices for their warming and drying properties, which were thought to balance the humors of the body. Spices also had religious and ritual uses that contributed to their value. Frankincense and myrrh, which were produced in southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa, were used extensively in Christian liturgical practice, with the incense that filled medieval churches coming from these same trade routes that brought pepper and cinnamon. The association of spices with the Holy Land and the places mentioned in the Bible added to their mystique and value. The fact that spices came from distant, exotic lands that were associated with paradise and the Garden of Eden gave them an aura of the sacred and the mysterious that enhanced their appeal. The social value of spices in medieval Europe cannot be separated from their economic value. Spices were symbols of status and wealth, with the ability to serve heavily spiced dishes at a feast, demonstrating the host's resources and connections. The spices themselves were often displayed as part of the dining experience, with pepper and cinnamon kept in ornate containers that were brought to the table for guests to add to their food. The distribution of spices as gifts was an important part of political and social relationships, with rulers and nobles giving spices to allies and subordinates as a sign of favor. The English King Richard I, for example, received a daily allotment of 4 pounds of cinnamon and 2 pounds of pepper during his captivity in Germany, a sign of the high status accorded to these precious commodities. The economic importance of the spice trade to the city-states of Italy cannot be overstated. Venice, in particular, built its commercial empire on the spice trade, using its control of the distribution of spices to northern Europe as the foundation of its economic and political power. The Venetian state regulated the spice trade carefully, requiring that all spices imported into Venice be sold in designated markets, and that merchants adhere to strict quality standards. The revenues from customs duties on spices and other luxury goods provided a significant portion of the Venetian budget, funding the construction of the city's magnificent public buildings and the maintenance of its powerful navy. The spice trade also created a class of wealthy merchant families, such as the Contarini, the Dandolo, and the Zeno, who used their commercial wealth to finance political careers and to commission art and architecture that celebrated their success. The spice economy was not limited to the trade between Asia and Europe, but also included extensive intra-Asian trade that was larger in volume and value than the European trade. The markets of China, India, and the Islamic world consumed spices in quantities that dwarfed European consumption, with spices used not only for cooking and medicine, but also for perfumery, incense, and religious ritual. Chinese records from the Song and Yuan dynasties show that spices were imported from Southeast Asia and India in enormous quantities, with the government regulating the spice trade through a system of licensed merchants and designated ports. The maritime trade of China, which reached its peak under the Song dynasty, was oriented primarily towards Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, with Chinese merchants actively participating in the spice trade as shippers and traders. The spice economy of the medieval period represented a remarkable achievement of human organization, connecting producers on remote islands with consumers across the known world through systems of trade that spanned thousands of miles and involved multiple intermediaries, languages, cultures, and legal systems. The spices that were consumed in the courts of England and France had traveled farther and passed through more hands than any other commodities of the period, and their value reflected not only their scarcity and the costs of their production, but also the complex web of relationships that brought them to market. The spice trade was the economic engine that drove the expansion of maritime commerce in the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean, and it provided the incentives that would eventually lead European explorers to seek direct access to the sources of these precious commodities. The maritime trade that carried spices from the Moluccas to the markets of Europe and beyond depended fundamentally on the ships that made these voyages possible. The medieval period saw remarkable developments in shipbuilding and maritime technology across the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Mediterranean. These developments were not isolated, but rather interconnected, with shipbuilders and sailors learning from each other, adapting technologies from different traditions, and developing new solutions to the challenges of long-distance maritime commerce. The ships that carried the spice trade were marvels of their time, representing the accumulated knowledge of centuries of maritime experience. The Indian Ocean world developed distinct shipbuilding traditions that were adapted to the specific conditions of the region. The most famous of these traditions was the dhow, a general term that encompassed a range of vessel types used throughout the western Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf. Dhows were characterized by their hulls, which were built from planks that were sewn together coconut fiber rather than fastened with nails. This method of construction, which had been used in the Indian Ocean for centuries before the medieval period, produced hulls that were flexible and resilient, able to withstand the stresses of the open ocean and the impact of coral reefs without breaking apart. The sewing technique involved drilling holes in the planks and passing coconut fiber through them in a complex pattern that created a strong, watertight seam. The fiber would swell when wet, making the hull even more watertight, and the flexibility of the joint allowed the hull to absorb shocks that would have shattered a nailed hull. The use of sewn plank construction required great skill and experience, as the shipwright had to select the right timbers, prepare them properly, and sew them together with just the right tension. The timbers used for dhow construction came from various sources, with teak from India and Southeast Asia being particularly prized for its durability and resistance to marine borers. African hardwoods, including various species of mahogany and other dense woods, were also used, particularly for ships built on the Swahili coast. The planks were shaped using adzes and other tools, and the edges were carefully fitted together to create a smooth, fair hull. The sewing was done by specialized workers who knew the correct patterns and tensions for different parts of the hull. The lateen sail was another key innovation associated with the dhow, and with Indian Ocean maritime technology more broadly. The lateen sail, which was triangular and set on a long yard that could be pivoted to catch the wind from different directions, allowed ships to sail closer to the wind than the square sails that dominated European shipping in the early medieval period. This capability was crucial for navigating the Indian Ocean, where the monsoon winds required ships to sail against the wind for portions of their voyages. The lateen sail also allowed ships to maneuver more effectively in the confined waters of the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, where the ability to tack against the wind was essential for safe navigation. The development of the lateen sail is a subject of scholarly debate, with some arguing for its origins in the Indian Ocean, and others suggesting that it developed in the Mediterranean and was adopted in the Indian Ocean through contacts between the two maritime regions. Regardless of its origins, the lateen sail became the standard rig for ships throughout the Indian Ocean and was later adopted by European shipbuilders who recognized its advantages. The caravel, the ship that Portuguese explorers used to explore the west coast of Africa and eventually to reach India, combined lateen sails with a hull design that incorporated elements from both Mediterranean and Atlantic shipbuilding traditions. The other great shipbuilding tradition of the medieval period was that of China, which produced the junk, a vessel type that was in many ways more advanced than any ship being built in Europe or the Islamic world. The Chinese junk was characterized by several distinctive features: a hull with a flat bottom and a keel that provided stability, multiple masts that carried sails, made of bamboo matting, watertight compartments that prevented the ship from sinking if one compartment was breached, and a sophisticated rudder that could be raised and lowered to adjust to different water depths. The watertight compartments, which were a Chinese innovation that appeared as early as the Han Dynasty, represented a major advance in ship design, as they greatly reduced the risk of sinking from hull damage. The size of Chinese ships in the medieval period was extraordinary by any standard. During the Song and Yuan dynasties, Chinese merchants and the Chinese Navy built ships that were capable of carrying hundreds of tons of cargo and dozens or even hundreds of crew members. The ships that sailed from Chinese ports to Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean were among the largest vessels in the world, dwarfing the dhows and other ships that they encountered in Southeast Asian ports. The Chinese shipbuilding industry was highly organized, with government shipyards producing standardized vessels for naval and commercial use, and private shipyards building vessels for merchants who operated throughout the East and South China Seas. The peak of Chinese maritime technology came during the Ming Dynasty, when the Emperor Yongle sponsored a series of voyages under the command of Admiral Zhang He. Between 1405 and 1433, Zhang He led 7 expeditions that traveled throughout Southeast Asia, the Indian Ocean, and as far west as the east coast of Africa. The ships that carried these expeditions were enormous by any standard, with the largest being described as over 400 feet long, far larger than any European ship of the time. Whether these dimensions are accurate or exaggerated, there is no doubt that the ships of the Ming treasure fleet were the most advanced vessels of their time, incorporating all the innovations of Chinese shipbuilding and representing the culmination of centuries of maritime development. The ships of Southeast Asia represented a third tradition of shipbuilding that combined elements from both the Indian Ocean and Chinese traditions. The people of the Indonesian archipelago, the Malay Peninsula, and the Philippines developed sophisticated shipbuilding technologies that allowed them to sail throughout the islands and across the open ocean to Madagascar, which was settled from Southeast Asia long before the medieval period. The ships of Southeast Asia were built from tropical hardwoods that were abundant in the region, and they incorporated features such as outriggers that provided stability in the open ocean and lash lug construction that allowed for flexible, strong hulls. The maritime technology of the medieval period also included a range of innovations in navigation that allowed sailors to find their way across open oceans with remarkable accuracy. The most important of these was the compass, which was developed in China and spread to the Indian Ocean and Europe during the medieval period. The Chinese had been using magnetic compasses for navigation since at least the Song Dynasty, and the technology was adopted by sailors throughout the region. The compass allowed sailors to maintain a consistent course even when out of sight of land, and it greatly reduced the risks of long-distance voyages. The astrolabe which was used to measure the altitude of the sun and stars, was another important navigation tool that was refined during the medieval period. The astrolabe had been developed by Greek astronomers and was adopted and improved by Islamic scholars who used it for both astronomical observation and navigation by measuring the altitude of Polaris or other stars. Sailors could determine their latitude with reasonable accuracy, allowing them to sail along known latitudes and to find their way to specific ports. The combination of the compass and the astrolabe gave medieval sailors capabilities that would have been unimaginable to their predecessors. And these tools were essential for the long-distance voyages that characterized the spice trade. The knowledge of the monsoon winds and the ocean currents was perhaps the most important navigation tool of all. And this knowledge was accumulated over centuries of experience. Sailors from the Indian Ocean world understood the patterns of the monsoon winds in great detail, knowing when the winds would shift, how long the favorable winds would last, and what routes were safest at different times of the year. This knowledge was passed down through generations, often in oral form, and it allowed sailors to plan voyages with confidence. The timing of voyages was critical, as ships that missed the monsoon window might be stranded in a distant port for months, incurring costs and risking damage to their cargoes. The ports of the medieval period developed sophisticated infrastructure to support the maritime trade that was the basis of their prosperity. The great ports of the Indian Ocean, including Aden, Hormuz, Calicut, Malacca, and Kwanju, had warehouses for storing goods, markets for buying and selling, facilities for repairing ships, and supplies of food and water for crews. These ports also had legal and commercial institutions that facilitated trade, including courts that could enforce contracts, officials who weighed and measured goods to ensure fair dealing, and money changers who could convert the various currencies that circulated in the region. The port cities were often multicultural, with communities of merchants from across the Indian Ocean world living in designated quarters and maintaining their own religious and legal institutions. The management of a medieval trading voyage required careful planning and coordination. Merchants had to arrange for the purchase or charter of a ship, the recruitment of a crew, the loading of cargo, and the financing of the voyage. The ship itself was a complex organization, with the captain responsible for navigation and the safety of the ship, the merchants or their agents responsible for the cargo, and the crew responsible for the operation of the ship. The relationships among these groups were governed by maritime law, which had developed over centuries to address the particular challenges of sea travel. The law of general average, for example, which required that losses incurred for the common good be shared among all parties with an interest in the voyage, was already well established in the medieval period. The dangers of maritime travel in the medieval period were substantial, and shipwrecks were common. The archaeological record of the Indian Ocean contains numerous shipwrecks that testify to the risks of the trade. The Belitung shipwreck, which has already been mentioned, is only one of many that have been discovered. The wreck of a 9th century Arab dhow off the coast of Indonesia, the wreck of a 14th century Chinese ship off the coast of Korea, and the wrecks of numerous vessels in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf provide evidence of the scale of maritime activity and the frequency of losses. These shipwrecks also provide invaluable information about the construction of medieval ships and the cargoes they carried, information that often cannot be obtained from written sources alone. The shipbuilding and maritime technologies of the medieval period were not static, but rather developed in response to changing conditions and new challenges. The increase in the volume of trade, the opening of new routes, and the emergence of new political powers all stimulated innovation in ship design and construction. The Portuguese, when they entered the Indian Ocean in the late 15th century, brought their own shipbuilding traditions, including the caravel and the carrack, which were adapted to Atlantic conditions. These ships were different from the dhows and junks that they encountered in the Indian Ocean, and the encounter of these different maritime traditions would have profound consequences for the future of global maritime commerce. The maritime spice trade of the medieval period was not a diffuse network of random contacts, but rather a highly organized system centered on a small number of great port cities that served as nodes of exchange between different regions and commercial systems. These port cities were not merely places where ships docked and cargoes were transferred. They were complex social, economic, and political entities that played active roles in the organization and regulation of trade. The great ports of the Indian Ocean whirled Aden at the southern end of the Red Sea, Hormuz at the entrance to the Persian Gulf, Calicut on the Malabar coast of India, and Malacca on the Malay Peninsula were the pillars of the spice trade, and understanding their history is essential for understanding the trade itself. Aden, located at the southwestern corner of the Arabian Peninsula, occupied a strategic position at the junction of the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. The city was built on the site of an ancient volcanic crater that had been flooded by the sea, creating a natural harbor that was protected from the open ocean by the crater walls. This natural protection made Aden one of the safest harbors in the Indian Ocean, and ships from across the region sought shelter in its waters. The city's location gave it control over access to the Red Sea, and through it to Egypt and the Mediterranean, making it an essential link in the chain that connected the spice-producing regions of the East with the consuming markets of the West. The importance of Aden in the spice trade grew steadily during the medieval period. In the 10th and 11th centuries, the city was controlled by the Ziyadid dynasty, which recognized the commercial value of the port and encouraged trade with India and East Africa. The Fatimids of Egypt, who conquered Aden in the 11th century, also recognized its importance and invested in its development as a commercial center. But it was under the Rasulid dynasty which ruled Yemen from the 13th to the 15th centuries, that Aden reached its peak as a commercial emporium. The Rasulid sultans were active promoters of trade, maintaining the port facilities, providing security for merchants, and establishing a system of customs duties that provided revenue for the state while not discouraging trade. The Rasulid administration of Aden was remarkably sophisticated. The sultans maintained detailed records of trade, including the quantities of goods that passed through the port, the customs duties that were collected, and the prices of different commodities. These records, many of which survive, provide an extraordinary window into the workings of medieval maritime trade. They show that Aden was a hub for the spice trade, with pepper, ginger, and other spices from India being transshipped through the port on their way to the Red Sea. They also show that Aden was a center for the trade in other commodities, including textiles, metals, and horses, which were imported from India and exported to the markets of Arabia and East Africa. The merchants of Aden were a cosmopolitan group, representing the various communities that participated in the Indian Ocean trade. Arab merchants, many of whom had been involved in the trade for generations, dominated the commercial life of the city. But there were also Persian, Indian, Jewish, and Christian merchants who maintained establishments in the port. The Rasulid sultans recognized the value of these communities and granted them privileges that encouraged them to continue trading through Aden. The Jewish merchants, whose correspondence was preserved in the Cairo Geniza, were particularly active in Aden, and the documents from the Geniza provide detailed information about the operations of the Jewish merchant community in the city. Aden's role in the spice trade was not limited to the transshipment of goods. The city was also a center for the distribution of spices and other goods to the markets of Arabia and East Africa. Ships from Aden sailed down the East African coast as far as Kilwa and Sofala, carrying Indian spices and textiles to be exchanged for gold, ivory, and slaves. The East African trade was an important part of Aden's commercial network, and the city maintained close relations with the Swahili coast cities that were the centers of the African trade. The archaeological evidence from East African sites shows the presence of goods that passed through Aden, including Chinese ceramics, Indian textiles, and Arabian glass, all of which were distributed through the Aden network. Hormuz, located on the island of Jaran at the entrance to the Persian Gulf, was the other great gateway between the Indian Ocean and the lands of the Middle East. The city's strategic position allowed it to control access to the Persian Gulf, and through it, to the markets of Persia, Mesopotamia, and the lands beyond. Hormuz's rise to prominence began in the 13th century, when the rulers of the city moved from the mainland to the island to escape the attacks of the Mongols. The island location provided natural protection, and the rulers of Hormuz invested heavily in the development of the port, building walls, warehouses, and water cisterns that made the city a safe and convenient place for trade. The commercial success of Hormuz was based on its position as the link between the Indian Ocean trade and the overland routes that crossed Persia and Mesopotamia. Goods arriving at Hormuz from India, Southeast Asia, and East Africa were unloaded and then transported by caravan to the cities of Persia, to Baghdad, and to the Mediterranean ports of the Levant. The overland routes were well established, with caravans carrying goods across the Iranian plateau to Tabriz and other commercial centers. The Mongol conquest of Persia in the 13th century initially disrupted this trade, but the Mongols soon recognized the value of commerce and took steps to protect and promote it. The Pax Mongolica, which made travel across Central Asia safer than it had been for centuries, actually benefited Hormuz, as goods could now be transported overland from the Persian Gulf to the Black Sea and the Mediterranean through Mongol-controlled territory. The merchants of Hormuz were renowned throughout the Indian Ocean world for their wealth and their commercial skills. The city was described by travelers including Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta as one of the great commercial centers of the world, a place where merchants from India, China, East Africa, and Europe gathered to buy and sell. Polo, who visited Hormuz in the late 13th century, described it as a city where the merchants of India come with their ships laden with spices, precious stones, pearls, gold, silver, silk, and other valuable goods, and they sell them to the merchants of Hormuz, who then distribute them throughout the world. The wealth of Hormuz was legendary, and the city's rulers, who controlled the trade and collected the customs duties, were among the richest rulers in the region. The relationship between Hormuz and the mainland powers was complex and sometimes tense. The rulers of Hormuz maintained their independence by paying tribute to the successive empires that controlled Persia, the Mongols, the Ilkhanids, the Timurids, and later the Safavids, while retaining control over the port and its commercial operations. This balancing act required careful diplomacy, and at times, the payment of substantial sums to keep the mainland powers satisfied. The strategic importance of Hormuz, however, gave the rulers leverage, as any power that controlled the mainland had an interest in maintaining the flow of trade through the port, which provided revenues and access to the goods of the Indian Ocean. Calicut on the Malabar coast of India was the third great pillar of the medieval spice trade, and in many ways the most important. While Aden and Hormuz served as gateways between the Indian Ocean and the lands of the Middle East, Calicut was the source of many of the spices that were traded, particularly pepper, which was produced in the Malabar region. The city's position on the Malabar coast, where the monsoon winds made direct sailing to and from the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf relatively straightforward, made it a natural destination for ships from the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf. The rulers of Calicut, known as the Zamorans, recognized the value of their position and created a commercial system that was remarkably open and welcoming to foreign merchants. The Zamorans of Calicut were Hindu rulers who governed a region that was home to a diverse population of Hindus, Muslims, Christians, and Jews. The Zamorans' policy was to encourage trade by providing security and fair treatment to all merchants, regardless of their religion or origin. The city had no walls, reflecting the Zamorans' confidence in their ability to maintain order through their reputation and the loyalty of their subjects. Foreign merchants were allowed to establish their own quarters, governed by their own laws and customs, and the Zamorans appointed officials known as shabandars to represent the interests of the merchant communities and to resolve disputes. The system worked remarkably well, and Calicut became known throughout the Indian Ocean as a place where merchants could trade in safety and with confidence. The pepper trade was the foundation of Calicut's prosperity. The Malabar coast produced pepper in enormous quantities, with the pepper vines being cultivated throughout the region by small-scale farmers who sold their harvest to local merchants. The pepper was brought to Calicut, where it was weighed, sorted, and packaged for export. The merchants of Calicut, many of whom were Muslims from Arabia and Persia, who had settled in the city, had long-standing relationships with the pepper producers and with the merchants who came from Aden and Hormuz to purchase the pepper. These relationships were based on trust and mutual benefit, and they allowed the trade to function smoothly despite the distances and the risks involved. The Jewish merchants of the Cairo Geniza were particularly active in the Calicut trade. The documents from the Geniza show that Jewish merchants from Egypt and Yemen sent agents to Calicut to purchase pepper and other spices, which were then shipped back to Aden and on to Egypt. The correspondence between these merchants and their agents in Calicut provides detailed information about the operations of the trade, including the prices of spices, the availability of shipping, and the political conditions that affected trade. The documents also reveal the personal relationships that underpin the trade, with merchants relying on family members and trusted associates to manage their affairs across vast distances. The religious dimensions of the Calicut trade were significant and complex. The Zamorans, as Hindu rulers, presided over a society that was religiously diverse, and they maintained relationships with the leaders of the various religious communities. The Muslim merchants of Calicut, many of whom had been in the city for generations, played a particularly important role in the trade, serving as intermediaries between the Zamorans and the foreign merchants who came to the city. The Jewish merchants, while a smaller community, also had a significant presence, and their connections to the Jewish communities of the Middle East made them valuable partners in the trade. The Christians of Malabar, who traced their origins to the arrival of St. Thomas in the 1st century, maintained their own trading networks and contributed to the commercial vitality of the region. Malacca, on the Malay Peninsula, was the 4th great pillar of the medieval spice trade and the gateway to the spice-producing islands of the Indonesian archipelago. The city's location at the narrowest point of the Straits of Malacca gave it control over the passage between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, making it the natural gathering place for ships from both directions. The founding of Malacca as a major commercial center is traditionally dated to the early 15th century, when a prince from Sumatra established a settlement on the site and began to attract merchants from across the region. The city grew rapidly, benefiting from the political stability provided by its rulers and from its strategic location on the straits. The rulers of Malacca, who converted to Islam in the mid-15th century, were active promoters of trade. They established a system of laws that regulated commerce, provided security for merchants, and encouraged the settlement of foreign traders. The city's harbor was protected by a breakwater, and the rulers maintained a fleet of ships that patrolled the straits to prevent piracy. The success of these policies was evident in the rapid growth of the city, which by the end of the 15th century had become the largest and most prosperous commercial center in Southeast Asia. Malacca was described by the Portuguese writer Tomé Pires as a city that was made for merchandise, richer and more important than any other city in the world. The spice trade was central to Malacca's prosperity. The city was the primary market for cloves, nutmeg, and mace from the Moluccas, and for pepper from Sumatra and Java. Ships from the Indonesian archipelago brought these spices to Malacca, where they were purchased by merchants from India, China, and the Middle East. The Chinese trade was particularly important, with Chinese merchants bringing silk, porcelain, and other goods to Malacca in exchange for spices and other Southeast Asian products. The Chinese government under the Ming Dynasty had a particular interest in Malacca, and the city was visited by the treasure fleets of Admiral Zhang He on several occasions. The merchants of Malacca, like those of the other great ports, represented a diverse range of communities. Malay merchants dominated the local trade, while merchants from India, particularly from Gujarat and the Coromandel coast, controlled much of the long-distance trade to the Indian Ocean. Chinese merchants maintained a permanent community in Malacca, and Arab and Persian merchants also had a presence in the city. The diversity of the merchant community was reflected in the languages, religions, and customs that could be observed in the city, which was one of the most cosmopolitan places in the world. The relationships among the four great ports were complex and dynamic. Aden and Hormuz competed for the trade that passed between the Indian Ocean and the Middle East, with the balance shifting depending on political conditions and the relative costs of the routes. Calicut was the source of the pepper that was the most important spice in terms of volume, and the city maintained relationships with both Aden and Hormuz. Malacca was the source of the spices from the Moluccas, and the city's prosperity depended on maintaining access to the Indian Ocean through the Straits of Malacca and to the South China Sea through the islands of Indonesia. The four ports were nodes in a network that extended across the Indian Ocean, and their prosperity was interdependent. The political and commercial systems that developed in these ports were not static, but evolved in response to changing conditions. The rise of new powers, such as the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid dynasty in Persia, affected the trade routes through the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. The arrival of the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean at the end of the 15th century would eventually transform the system, as the Portuguese sought to control the spice trade by force and to exclude Muslim merchants from the trade. But for centuries before the Portuguese arrival, the port cities of the Indian Ocean had maintained a system of open trade that allowed merchants from across the region to exchange goods and to profit from the commerce that connected the spice-producing regions of the East with the consuming markets of the West. The spice trade of the medieval period was not conducted by isolated individuals operating in a commercial vacuum, but rather by networks of merchants who were connected by ties of kinship, religion, ethnicity, and shared commercial interests. These networks extended across the Indian Ocean world, linking merchants in the ports of China with those in India, the Middle East, and East Africa, and providing the infrastructure that made long-distance trade possible. Understanding these merchant networks and the business practices they developed is essential for understanding how the spice trade operated and how it was able to function across vast distances in the absence of modern communications and legal systems. The merchant communities of the Indian Ocean world were often organized along ethnic and religious lines. The Gujarati merchants of Western India, for example, were predominantly Hindu and Jain, and they maintained trading networks that extended from East Africa to Southeast Asia. The Chetty merchants of the Coromandel Coast were Hindu merchants who specialized in the trade between India and Southeast Asia. The Muslim merchants of the Malabar Coast, many of whom were descended from Arab and Persian traders who had settled in India centuries before, maintained close ties with the merchants of the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf. The Chinese merchants who traded in Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean were organized along family and regional lines, with merchants from Fujian province being particularly active in overseas trade. The Jewish merchants whose records were preserved in the Cairo Geniza represent one of the best documented merchant communities of the medieval period. These merchants, who were based primarily in Cairo, but had agents and partners from Spain to India, were connected by ties of kinship and shared religion that provided a foundation for trust and cooperation. The Geniza documents show that Jewish merchants relied on family members to manage their affairs in distant ports, sending sons, brothers, and nephews to represent their interests in Aden, Calicut, and other trading centers. When family members were not available, they partnered with trusted associates who were often fellow Jews and sometimes members of the same extended family. The Jewish merchants of the Geniza developed sophisticated business practices that allowed them to manage the risks of long-distance trade. They used the commenda, a form of partnership in which one party provided the capital and and the other undertook the voyage to share the risks and rewards of trade. The commenda was an ancient institution that had been used by merchants in the Mediterranean and the Middle East for centuries, and it was well suited to the needs of long-distance trade. The traveling merchant, who contributed his labor and expertise, would receive a share of the profits, typically 1/4 to 1/3, while the sedentary merchant, who provided the capital, would receive the remainder. This arrangement allowed merchants to spread their capital across multiple voyages, reducing the risk of losing everything to a single shipwreck or robbery. The contracts that governed these partnerships were detailed and legally enforceable. The Genesa documents include numerous examples of commenda contracts, which specify the amount of capital being invested, the duration of the voyage, the destinations to be visited, the goods to be purchased, and the division of profits. These contracts were written in accordance with Jewish law, which had its own provisions for commercial partnerships, but they were also designed to be enforceable in the courts of the lands where the merchants operated. The merchants of the Genesa were careful to document their transactions, keeping copies of contracts, letters of credit, and other legal documents that could be used to resolve disputes. The letters exchanged between merchants provide a window into the daily operations of the trade. These letters, which were carried by ship captains and other travelers, contain instructions about the purchase and sale of goods, reports on market conditions, news about political developments that might affect trade, and personal news that reflects the human dimensions of the merchant network. The letters also reveal the challenges of long-distance communication, with messages taking months to arrive and responses often crossing in transit. The delays and uncertainties of communication meant that merchants had to trust their agents to exercise discretion and to act in their interests without constant supervision. The concept of trust was fundamental to the operation of these merchant networks. In the absence of modern legal systems that could enforce contracts across borders, merchants relied on reputation and social networks to ensure that agreements would be honored. A merchant who cheated his partners or failed to honor his debts would find himself excluded from the network, unable to obtain credit or to find partners for future voyages. The merchant communities developed mechanisms for enforcing trust, including informal courts that could arbitrate disputes, and in some cases, excommunication for merchants who violated the norms of the community. The emphasis on trust and reputation meant that merchant networks were often closed to outsiders, with membership being based on kinship, ethnicity, or religion. The Italian merchants who dominated the Mediterranean spice trade developed their own networks and business practices that were in many ways similar to those of their counterparts in the Indian Ocean. The Venetians, Genoese, and Pisans created sophisticated commercial systems that included partnerships, insurance, double entry bookkeeping, and bills of exchange that allowed merchants to transfer funds without moving physical coin. Italian city-states also developed legal systems that supported commerce, with courts that could enforce contracts and resolve disputes quickly. The Italian merchants established colonies in the ports of the Levant and Egypt, where they lived under their own laws and maintained their own churches, markets, and commercial institutions. The relationship between the Italian merchants and the merchants of the Indian Ocean world was mediated by the merchants of the Middle East. The spices that reached Italy came through the ports of Egypt and the Levant, where Italian merchants purchased them from Arab and Jewish wholesalers who had imported them from India and Southeast Asia. The Italian merchants did not, in the medieval period, travel to India or Southeast Asia, relying instead on the networks of the Middle Eastern merchants who controlled the trade. This arrangement was profitable for both sides, but it also meant that the Italians were dependent on the Middle Eastern merchants for access to spices, and were subject to the prices and terms that the Middle Eastern merchants set. The merchants of the Indian Ocean world were not merely passive participants in a trade that was controlled by others, but were active agents who shaped the development of the spice trade. The Muslim merchants of Gujarat and the Malabar coast, for example, were instrumental in spreading Islam to Southeast Asia, establishing trading posts and communities that facilitated the exchange of goods and ideas. The spread of Islam to the Malay Peninsula and the Indonesian archipelago was closely linked to the expansion of trade, with merchants from India and Arabia establishing settlements in port cities and intermarrying with local populations. The conversion of the rulers of Malacca to Islam in the 15th century was a landmark event that reflected the influence of Muslim merchants, and that cemented Malacca's position as the center of the Southeast Asian spice trade. The Chinese merchants who participated in the maritime trade of the Indian Ocean were organized along different lines than their counterparts in the Islamic world. Chinese merchants operated through family firms and guilds that regulated trade and provided mutual support. The Chinese government played a more active role in regulating overseas trade than did the governments of most other regions, with the Song and Yuan dynasties establishing official trading offices that issued licenses to merchants and collected duties on imported goods. The Ming dynasty initially continued this system, but later imposed restrictions on overseas trade that drove many Chinese merchants to operate illegally or to base themselves in Southeast Asia. The scale of Chinese involvement in the Indian Ocean trade varied over time. During the Song dynasty, Chinese merchants were active throughout Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, with Chinese ships visiting ports in India, Ceylon, and the Persian Gulf. The Yuan dynasty, which was established by the Mongols, continued this pattern, with Chinese merchants benefiting from the Pax Mongolica that made trade across Asia safer. The Ming dynasty's decision to withdraw from overseas trade after the voyages of Zheng, he represented a significant shift, with the Chinese government turning inward and restricting the activities of Chinese merchants abroad. This shift opened opportunities for other merchant communities, particularly the Gujaratis and the Malay merchants, who filled the gap left by the Chinese withdrawal. The business practices of medieval merchants were sophisticated and reflected a deep understanding of the risks and opportunities of long-distance trade. Merchants developed methods for hedging against currency fluctuations, for ensuring cargoes against loss, and for spreading risk across multiple investments. The use of bills of exchange allowed merchants to transfer funds without the risk of carrying large amounts of coin, and the development of double entry bookkeeping in Italy provided a systematic way of tracking assets, liabilities, and profits. These innovations, many of which were developed in response to the needs of the spice trade, laid the foundations for the development of modern capitalism. The financing of the spice trade required substantial amounts of capital, and the sources of this capital varied across the merchant communities. Some merchants were wealthy individuals who could finance voyages from their own resources, but most relied on partnerships and loans to raise the necessary capital. The commenda, as already noted, was a common form of partnership that allowed sedentary merchants to invest in voyages without undertaking the risks of travel. In addition to partnerships, merchants used loans from banks and from other merchants to finance their operations. The interest rates on these loans reflected the risks of the trade, with rates being higher for voyages to distant destinations or through dangerous waters. The social status of merchants varied across the different societies of the Indian Ocean world. In the Islamic world, merchants were generally respected as honorable members of society, and the Prophet Muhammad's own background as a merchant gave the profession a certain prestige. In India, merchants occupied a respected position in the social hierarchy, with Hindu and Jain merchants being prominent patrons of temples and religious institutions. In China, merchants were theoretically at the bottom of the social hierarchy, below scholars, farmers, and artisans. But in practice, wealthy merchants wielded significant influence and often married into scholar-official families. The status of merchants in Europe was also complex, with the Italian merchant families of Venice and Genoa being among the most powerful and influential families in their cities. The role of women in the merchant communities of the medieval period is a subject of growing scholarly interest. The Geniza documents show that Jewish women were involved in commerce in various ways, with some women managing businesses, lending money, and even traveling for trade. The documents reveal that women could own property, enter into contracts, and represent themselves in court, and that they were not entirely excluded from the commercial networks that dominated the trade. The extent of women's involvement in other merchant communities is less well documented, but it is clear that women played important roles in the family firms that were the basic units of commercial organization in many parts of the Indian Ocean world. The merchant networks of the medieval period were not limited to economic transactions, but also served as conduits for the exchange of culture, religion, and ideas. Merchants who traveled between ports carried with them not only goods, but also languages, religious practices, and cultural traditions. The spread of Islam to Southeast Asia was driven in large part by merchants who established communities in port cities and intermarried with local populations. The spread of Buddhism from India to Southeast Asia and China was also facilitated by merchants who traveled the same maritime routes that carried spices and other goods. The merchant networks that supported the spice trade were thus also networks of cultural transmission, connecting the civilizations of Asia, Africa, and Europe in ways that shaped the development of all of them. The Cairo Geniza is one of the most extraordinary historical archives ever discovered, providing an unparalleled window into the social, economic, and cultural life of the medieval Middle East and the Indian Ocean world. The Geniza was a storage room in the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Fustat, the old part of Cairo, where for centuries the Jewish community deposited documents that contained the name of God and could not therefore be destroyed. The dry climate of Egypt preserved these documents for nearly 1,000 years, and when they were rediscovered in the late 19th century, they yielded a treasure trove of information about every aspect of medieval Jewish life. The Geniza collection contains approximately 350,000 individual fragments, ranging from complete manuscripts to small scraps of paper. The documents span the period from the 10th to the 19th centuries, but the bulk of the material dates from the 11th to the 13th centuries, the period when the Jewish community of Fustat was at its peak. The documents include legal contracts, letters, accounts, religious texts, poetry, and personal correspondence. And they come from every level of society, from the wealthy merchants who dominated the long-distance trade to the ordinary craftsmen and laborers who made up the majority of the community. The importance of the Geniza for understanding the medieval spice trade lies in the documents that relate to the activities of Jewish merchants who participated in the trade between the Middle East and India. These documents, which were collected and studied by the scholar S.D. Goitin and his successors, provide detailed information about the organization of the trade, the commodities that were exchanged, the routes that were used, and the lives of the merchants who conducted the trade. The India Book, as Goitin called the collection of documents relating to the Indian trade, contains letters, contracts, and accounts that span more than 2 centuries and provide a continuous record of Jewish commercial activity in the Indian Ocean. The Jewish merchants of the Geniza were not a separate community operating in isolation, but were fully integrated into the commercial networks of the medieval Middle East. They traded with Muslim, Christian, and Jewish merchants throughout the region, and they used the same business practices and commercial instruments as their counterparts in other communities. The documents show that Jewish merchants were active in the trade between Egypt and the ports of the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Indian Ocean, and that they maintained agents and partners in Aden, Calicut, and other trading centers. The Jewish merchants of the Geniza were part of a larger commercial system that included merchants of all faiths, and their records provide insights into that system as a whole. The documents from the Geniza reveal the importance of family ties in the organization of the trade. Jewish merchants relied heavily on family members to represent their interests in distant ports, sending sons, brothers, and nephews to serve as agents and partners. The correspondence between family members shows that these relationships were not purely commercial, but also involved personal concerns about the health, safety, and well-being of the travelers. The letters contain instructions about business matters, but also expressions of affection, concerns about family members who had not written, and news of births, marriages, and deaths in the community at home. The partnership agreements preserved in the Geniza provide detailed information about the financial arrangements that underpinned the trade. The commenda, known in Jewish law as the iska, was the most common form of partnership, with the sedentary partner providing the capital and the traveling partner undertaking the voyage. The contracts specify the amount of capital being invested, the destinations to be visited, the goods to be purchased, and the division of profits. The typical division was 1/4 to 1/3 of the profits for the traveling partner, and the remainder for the sedentary partner, though the proportions varied depending on the amount of capital and the risks involved. The contracts also include provisions for the return of capital in the event of loss, specifying that the traveling partner was not liable for losses beyond his share of the capital. The letters exchanged between merchants provide a day-by-day account of the trade in operation. A merchant in Cairo would write to his agent in Aden or Calicut, instructing him on what goods to purchase, what prices to pay, and what ships to use for the return voyage. The agent would write back, reporting on market conditions, the availability of goods, the reliability of ship captains, and the political situation that might affect trade. The letters also contain complaints about the quality of goods, the dishonesty of local merchants, the delays caused by weather or political disturbances, and the difficulty of collecting debts. These letters give a vivid sense of the challenges and uncertainties of medieval long-distance trade. The Geniza documents also provide information about the commodities that were traded. Pepper was the most important spice, and it appears in virtually every document relating to the Indian trade. The letters discuss the quality of the pepper, the prices being offered, and the quantities available. Other spices mentioned include cinnamon, ginger, cardamom, and cloves, along with non-spice commodities such as textiles, metals, and medicines. The documents show that the Jewish merchants were not specialized in a single commodity, but traded in a range of goods, adjusting their purchases to market conditions and the availability of capital. The goods that were imported from India were distributed through the Jewish merchant network to markets throughout the Middle East and the Mediterranean. The letters from Cairo contain instructions to agents in Aden to purchase goods for specific customers in Egypt, North Africa, Syria, and even Europe. The distribution network was flexible, with merchants responding to changes in demand and to the arrival of goods from different sources. The documents also show that the Jewish merchants participated in the trade in goods that were re-exported to Europe, with Italian merchants being among the customers for the spices that passed through the Egyptian ports. The religious dimension of the Geniza documents is significant. The Jewish merchants operated within a legal framework that was based on Jewish law, and their contracts and other legal documents were written in accordance with Jewish legal forms. The community maintained its own courts, which could adjudicate disputes and enforce contracts, and the merchants used these courts to resolve conflicts with their partners and with other merchants. The religious identity of the merchants was also reflected in the letters, which often contain religious greetings and expressions of piety, and in the observance of religious holidays, which sometimes caused delays in business transactions. The relationship between the Jewish merchants and the Muslim authorities in Egypt and elsewhere was generally positive. The Fatimid and Ayyubid rulers of Egypt were generally tolerant of the Jewish community, and the merchants were able to operate freely within the framework of Islamic law. The documents show that Jewish merchants paid customs duties and other taxes, and that they were subject to the same regulations as Muslim merchants. The merchants also maintained relationships with Muslim merchants and officials, and the letters contain references to dealings with Muslim business partners and to gifts given to officials to facilitate the passage of goods. The Geniza documents also provide information about the ships and the sailors who carried the goods. The letters contain references to specific ships, to their captains, and to the routes they sailed. The merchants chose ships based on the reputation of the captain, the condition of the vessel, and the availability of space for their cargoes. The letters also contain discussions about the risks of sailing at different times of the year, with the monsoon winds determining the schedule of voyages to India. Ships that missed the monsoon window might be delayed for months, incurring costs and risking the deterioration of their cargoes. The dangers of the sea are a recurring theme in the Geniza documents. Shipwrecks, piracy, and storms are mentioned frequently, and the letters often contain accounts of goods lost at sea. The loss of a ship could be a disaster for the merchants who had invested in its cargo, and the letters show merchants struggling to recover from such losses and to meet their obligations to their partners and creditors. The documents also show that merchants took precautions against these risks, using insurance arrangements and spreading their capital across multiple voyages to reduce the impact of any single loss. The social world of the Jewish merchants is revealed in the personal letters that were preserved in the Geniza. These letters, which which were written between family members and friends, provide information about the lives of the merchants and their families that goes beyond the purely commercial. The letters contain news about marriages, births, and deaths, expressions of concern for the health and safety of travelers, and discussions of the social and political events that affected the community. The letters also reveal the emotional dimensions of the trade, with merchants expressing loneliness, anxiety, and hope in their correspondence with loved ones who were separated by vast distances. The decline of the Jewish merchant network in the Indian Ocean is reflected in the later documents from the Geniza. By the 13th century, the volume of Jewish trade with India appears to have declined, and the documents become fewer and less detailed. The reasons for this decline are not entirely clear, but they may include the political disruptions caused by the Crusades and the Mongol invasions, the rise of new trading powers that competed with the Jewish merchants, and the decline of the Fatimid and Ayyubid states that had provided a stable environment for trade. The Geniza documents thus capture a specific moment in the history of the Indian Ocean trade, a moment when Jewish merchants played a significant role in the commerce that connected the Middle East with India. The legacy of the Geniza for the study of medieval history is immense. The documents have provided historians with a level of detail about everyday life in the medieval Middle East that is available for no other region of the world. For the study of the spice trade, the Geniza documents have been particularly valuable, providing information about the organization of the trade, the business practices of the merchants, and the human dimensions of long-distance commerce that cannot be obtained from any other source. The Geniza documents also remind us that the spice trade was not just an economic phenomenon, but also a social and cultural one, involving real people with families, friendships, and emotions who were separated by vast distances and who struggled to maintain their connections across the oceans that both united and divided the world.